It's a pleasure to introduce our final speaker of the day. You have been a remarkably sustained attending audience. And so Judson Brewer is now the Director of Research at the Center for Mindfulness, an associate professor in medicine and psychiatry at UMass Medical Center, and he does not need that little toddler sync supporter. Yes, the frontal executive control is waning when we introduce at this hour of the day. So Judd is a friend of long standing, and we have been colleagues and collaborators and a touch of adversarial collaborators at points on papers and in discussion. And we were together at Zen Brain just a couple of months ago. And in encountering you, I thought you had to be here. It was just really wonderful to share the space and the world with you, and that meeting that Evan and John and I and Richie were at with Joan Halifax. And you now have sort of, you have a position at the research helm of a critical institution in the evolution of the promulgation of mindfulness in the world. So we want to know what it feels like to be in that position.
Great. Well, it's great to be here, Cliff. And likewise, it's been a wonderful journey where I often think back to having at least one meal with you at the Summer Research Institute, where despite our hearing not changing, our voices seem to get louder in our discussions, which led to one wonderful paper that I think you collaborated on, Evan collaborated on, and I learned the term adversarial collaborator, which is, okay, Cliff, if you hate this so much, then help me design an experiment to prove it right or wrong, but prove it one way or the other. And I hadn't heard that term before, and it was awesome. It was really fun to have that. And we continued, so it was great. And just a couple of things. One, I've learned a lot from Evan over the years about this embodied cognition. I'm not going to talk about that type of thing, but I think it really, because some of our discussions have led me to really think about what we can actually use with the heuristic models that we know. So I'm going to present some heuristic models, but they're just heuristic models. And I think of them in terms of, if we're trying to design a cancer treatment, we can't take the whole universe into mind when we're trying to diagnose somebody with cancer. You find the pathway, you find what the cancer is. Hopefully you find some molecule or something that can help that specific pathway, and then that helps that person. Context certainly matters there, but if we're waiting to gather every data point from every bit of context, then the person's going to die. So often, I'm a pragmatist, I'm a clinician and a pragmatist, so we're looking at what heuristics can we use to kind of get our foot in the door to start to learn something, so that then it can start to open up to these networks, and it's not just one many, it's the many stuff. So that's something that we can hopefully live into, but you're going to see some very heuristic and perhaps simplistic things here. I don't apologize for that. I think it's just a good place for us to start. So one place that I recently started is the Center for Mindfulness last year. This is a view from my window. It's a beautiful place. Come visit us anytime. And Cliff's charge for me today, which I'll try to take up because I haven't given a talk like this before, is to kind of look at what's going on at the Center for Mindfulness now, and I think it's very helpful to have a little bit of historical context. So we can start with now, and it's interesting. There was a recent Harvard study that showed that lots of people are stressed out. Okay, that's the bottom line, and it negatively affects the health in most of the folks that responded. What else is going on now? Cliff showed this slide earlier. Cover of Time magazine, Anderson Cooper came and did a segment of 60 Minutes on mindfulness where he came and got hooked up to our EEG rig. So there's something going on with mindfulness now in the present, okay? So what's the historical context for that a little bit? Now, I can't speak for Jon, but I think getting to know him over this last year and the last years that I've known him is really interesting. And my sense is that he's very much a pragmatist as well. And he came from this Korean Zen tradition and wanted to do something which he describes as that could kind of move the bell curve a little bit. I'm sure many of you have heard him describe it that way. And the other thing that he did, coming from a scientific background, it's interesting, I was a molecular biologist, he was a molecular biologist. He said, I want to do something that we can study so we can bring this into medical settings, so we can call this the, whatever derogatory terms you guys described earlier this morning, which is fine, because I think there's some legitimacy to that stuff. But he designed something so he could actually study it, which I thought was a really interesting and important piece here. So this is where the historical context of MBSR comes in, and I just use this as a place marker for that, not to define or even pretend to define mindfulness, because I think a lot of these are very open questions in terms of what are we actually talking about, and something that we need to get at if we're going to actually study this stuff. Not going to touch that today. What I will start with is the past. So this is the first study that Jon published, 1982. Single author. This is about chronic pain. It's interesting, if you look at this, 10 weeks, 65% of patients showed a reduction of greater than 33% in their pain rating index. And 50% of those showed greater than 50%. If there was a drug for this, this drug would be blockbuster. Whoever had stock in this would not be here because they'd be in the Bahamas, right? That's remarkable, 1982. So Cliff showed this slide earlier. First paper, okay? So the reason I show this is this was the seed for all of this, for the beginning of this field. And it started by somebody who was pragmatist, who said, and he was given chronic pain patients who nobody else could help. He was going around the hospital, he didn't want to piss people off. So he said, give me your patients that you can't do anything with. And they said, gladly. And he brought them in. They had big reductions in pain. He publishes his paper, and he's got some model that you can study. And that kind of led to, kind of started this whole thing. And as you know, there are a lot of MBSR programs worldwide now that are it's being delivered clinically. It's being studied in some of these, but it really, what is it, the war machine. Here. So if you want to go and wipe out the enemy, this is where the enemy is stationed, all over the place, right? It's a pox, it's whatever negative thing you want to think about it. But it's out there, so there's something going on, which is really interesting to think about. Now, here's where we are now, 2015. Willem Kuyken just published this paper, and the reason I put this up, this is with MBCT, which is an offshoot and a very close cousin to MBSR. Look at this. They can now say, we found no evidence that it is superior to medications. So now we can talk in clinical, this is a Lancet. This is like the British top medical journal. They're talking about not being superior to medications, as in not better than the best thing out there, which is very different than the way people were very carefully talking about this previously. So I bring this up because that's, you could read this as, oh yeah, it's not superior. You could read this historically and say, wow, they've been developing, if you think of the pharmaceutical industry, they've been developing medications since the 50s. They've spent how many trillions of dollars developing medications, and now in a short period of time, we have a treatment that is not better than. So just something to think about, because that really struck me when I read the paper. And I have to say, they must do something well with the NHS, because when you look at these data, they're looking at survival curve. The relapse rates for both of these were relatively low. So these are folks with recurrent depression, 3 or more episodes. And both these groups, they must have done a really good job, because both these groups showed less than 40% relapse after 2 years, which is very good. Major depression is very hard to treat. So one way that we can think about this is, with all this stuff that's come along in terms of all this clinical work and all these studies that are showing something, or at least getting the public, to say, okay, this is a legitimate field to study, this gives us some breathing space, okay? Okay, here's something legitimate. When I came to Yale for my residency training, and I said, yeah, I'm going to shift from doing molecular biology research to doing in immunology to studying mindfulness. And people were like, okay. One guy said, you're going to kill your career. And I didn't know. This was back in 2004. So this was back at the beginning of when things really started taking off. You know, this really did not seem legitimate at all. But now we have some breathing space. And to the point where we can all be here discussing this. So with this breathing space, we can start to ask more fundamental questions. At least I like to ask these questions. So we can think about stress. Like mindfulness-based stress reduction is about, framed around stress. And I like this, this frame that comes from one of the Nikayas. And again, I'm not a Pali scholar, but this is a nice translation about what is the noble truth of stress, not getting what is wanted. So we can start to look at heuristics of what's actually going on. Now, this is a picture that I took at the Louvre last December, and I think this is fascinating. Do you guys know what this thing is? Yeah, Time Magazine's top 25, one of the top 25 inventions of 2014, or as I like to joke, a sign of the apocalypse. So this picture is interesting because not only are these two women taking pictures of themselves, but this is the boyfriend that's now obsolete. He's kind of hunched over like, okay, I'm here. But we can look at this, thank you, and we can look at things in terms of how is this process getting set up to the point where there's now an invention for us to take pictures of ourselves, and there's something on the internet called YouTube. It's really MeTube, it's about me, and we have things like taking a selfie, and we have selfie sticks, and I'm going to skip through this, but basically, there's studies, you can think of this as blobology.
How are you feeling, Judson?
You can think of this as blobology, but it's interesting when you give people a choice to talk about themselves or earn money, they talk about themselves, and when they talk about themselves, they activate the nucleus accumbens, which is the same part of the brain that gets activated when you smoke crack cocaine. Now, the interesting piece here is not that this blob lights up, but you can actually predict outcomes. So this study showed that you can actually predict the amount of time that people spend on Facebook by the amount that their nucleus accumbens gets activated. And you can start to bring this stuff together to develop heuristics so that we can formulate hypotheses that we can test. Now, so then we can ask ourselves, okay, what are these heuristics? I like to use the associative learning paradigm. It's been well established in animal models and human models. I'm just using two examples in humans because these have been the most studied, where this heuristic talks about positive and negative reinforcement. So if you think about eating a good meal, it feels good. You have an urge for that to continue, so you either have a dessert or you smoke a cigarette. This lays down a memory and then reinforces the process. Same thing with negative reinforcement. Okay, Thorndike described this over 100 years ago. Skinner did a bunch of work in the 50s. Eric Kandel got the Nobel Prize, showing that this is conserved all the way back to the sea slug. 20,000 neurons, one of the most primitive nervous systems. They learn the same way as humans. Now, why do I bring this up? Because it looks like, and again, this certainly can be critiqued, and I'm sure will be, the early, if you want to think of them as the Buddhist psychologists, described this in what they termed the 12 links of dependent origination 2,500 years ago. Now, the only difference here is that they described this in terms of the birth of a self-identity because they weren't thinking in terms of memory formation, or at least they weren't describing it in those terms. And the other thing that they describe here, I'm going to use glasses here, but they use the term ignorance as kind of perpetuating or starting off the process. Well, it doesn't start off the process because it's a loop, but really perpetuated by ignorance. And as probably many of you know, this loop is termed samsara, and one translation of that is endless wandering because it just perpetuates itself. So described in modern terms, described in early terms, and a model heuristic that can be tested, where we can formulate hypotheses and test them. And we've actually tested one of these with smoking. I won't go through the details. If you're interested, I can send you the papers. And I just use that because they emphasize that the self, that memory is the me. And I think I like this Alan Watts quote because he really kind of sums that up. You know, the self which he has believed himself to be is nothing but a pattern of habits. Okay, so what about the future? Now I'm just going to describe this in terms of how my lab has been thinking about this. We can take clinical studies. So for example, we did a clinical study with mindfulness training compared to gold standard treatment for smoking, the American Lung Association's freedom from smoking, and found that it was actually twice as good for helping people quit smoking. So whatever was happening there, we could measure hard outcomes. This is biochemically verified smoking abstinence. And we found that after 4 weeks of treatment, they did twice as well, and they maintained their gains, which was really interesting to see. And we can take these and then we can start to ask ourselves, well, how do we actually disseminate this on a larger scale? And which turns to, you know, okay, well, if people are getting addicted to their phones, can we actually use this type of technology for benefit? And so we're in the middle of doing some clinical trials where we've taken that training and we can actually, you know, take the manualized treatment, put it in bite-sized pieces where people get daily modules, they get animations to drive the key points home. They actually get in vivo smoking exercises so they can smoke at the point of contact where they've learned it in a context-dependent manner. And we can also embed experience sampling so we can collect data to test efficacy. And we can do things like, this is just an example, probably most of you are familiar with the RAIN acronym, where we can just give people this acronym at the point of contact. And we did this specifically clinically because folks were saying, oh yeah, what was that thing in our in-person trial? And they would forget it. And so if they would go for 2 days without practicing, we can embed it right in what we were describing as the wantometer. We can pair this with online communities so people can actually share with each other. They can get feedback, et cetera. So I'm going to shift now to neural heuristics that we can develop hypotheses. And I like this story of Lolo Jones. Some of you have heard me describe it, so bear with me. But basically, Lolo Jones was an Olympic hurdler who was favored to win the 2008 Olympics. She was actually in the lead at the 9th of 10 hurdles. And then she tripped, and she finished 7th. And the story here in an interview she gave with Time Magazine was that she was having thoughts. She was like, oh, I'm winning. And then she started telling herself to do something, and she got caught up in her thinking. And that's when she tripped. She said, you know, and so it wasn't about that thinking. It was that she got caught up in that. And it turns out that we can get caught up in thinking. We can get caught up in all sorts of things. And in particular, in mind wandering. And that happens to the point, roughly, it's been estimated about 50% of waking life in one study. We spend mind wandering, and if it's that often, we can actually measure it. So Willoughby mentioned the default mode network, and this seems to correlate with activation of the default mode network, which also has an overlap with self-referential processing. Again, heuristics and blobs. So I won't get into the details. Now, it's interesting, if you look at one particular aspect of the default mode network, the posterior cingulate cortex, it gets activated during a bunch of different things. So here I'm showing an example of showing people with cocaine dependence videos of people smoking crack cocaine. This same group, Hugh Garavan, found that this same brain region gets activated during physiologic thirst. For those of you familiar with, and again, I'm not a Pali scholar, thirst is the literal translation of craving, of tanha in Pali. And it's interesting that this region gets activated during physiologic thirst, craving, during self-referential processing, and a bunch of other things. And so we can hypothesize, well, what is it about this self-referential processing that the posterior cingulate is a neural correlate for? And again, I'm thinking of this as not, you know, it is the neural correlate, but it is a marker of probably a vast extended network of things working together. And we can use this as our foot in the door so that we can start linking this to other processes. So again, I'm not reducing this to this is it, you know, this is a single blob, but this is something that can help us start to understand things. Okay, so we can hypothesize that maybe that brain region is a marker of getting caught up in experience, and that mindfulness training would be a way of helping us get out of not getting caught up and get out of our own way. So I won't go into the details because we published this a while ago, but it does seem that experienced meditators compared to novices especially collapsed across different conditions. So in this study, we looked at loving kindness, we looked at concentration, we also looked at choiceless awareness, and we looked to see where these converged. So we could say, is there some common neural correlate for these things? And indeed, the posterior cingulate cortex seems to be deactivated during these meditations in experienced meditators. It's interesting when you look at loving kindness by itself, that shows the same types of deactivation in the posterior cingulate cortex. Now we wanted to see. It's very important in neuroimaging to replicate your studies because a lot of these aren't replicated. So we just replicated that paper and it will be coming out. And it's still in press. But we also turned to neurofeedback as a way to try to not only replicate these results in individual subjects, because I think as Kathy was talking about, we lose so much by group averaging. One of my oncology attendings used to say, statistics are good for groups but not good for individuals when he would work with his oncology patients. And I think, as Kathy was pointing out, we lose a huge amount when we don't look at the individuals. And when we can so now we can try to find techniques where we can start to link that subjective experience and get it closer to brain activity in particular. We can also link this to many other physiologic processes. Ideally, this would be great if we could start to bring in folks like Evan to help us figure out ways to link subjective experience to brain activity to a bunch of other things, so we can start to bring these things together. So I'm just going to go through this quickly. For lack of time, but basically we can measure a brain region, we can every 2 seconds, and then we can graph it out for folks. And then we can relate how someone's subjective experience is lining up with increase or decrease in a particular brain region here in the posterior cingulate cortex. What we find is a very strong correspondence with people's subjective experience in this brain region, in novices and also in experienced meditators. And you can see here, there's without statistical methods, you can even see a difference between novices and experienced meditators. And then we can take this and then in a very simple way start to link it to subjective experience. So for example, if we want to see in particular if this brain region is affected by loving kindness meditation, these are just 2 examples of experienced meditators where we can track their subjective experience. And in this experienced meditator reported that he really sank into the loving kindness practice about halfway through, and you can see that lining up with this individual variability in the posterior cingulate cortex activity. Here's another example. It's really hard to find good jhana practitioners, folks that can practice absorptive concentration, and there can be a lot going on there. We can bring them into our scanner and have them practice different aspects of jhana and look at their subjective experience and also track their brain activity in real time. These are just 2 examples where you can see in different meditators that this is lining up. I'm just going to walk you through where we can also start to tie in their subjective self-report. So this is one experienced meditator. He said, I caught myself, I was trying to guess when the words were going to end. This was our active baseline that we were using, a word task. And when the meditation was going to begin, so I was trying to be like, okay, ready, set, go. And then there was an additional word that popped up, and I was like, oh shit, and you can see that red spike. And then I sort of immediately settled in, was really getting into it. And then I thought, oh my gosh, this is amazing. It's describing exactly what I'm saying. And so you see this red spike. And I was like, okay, don't get distracted. And I got back into it, and it went blue again. And he was like, oh my gosh, this is unbelievable. It's doing exactly what my mind's doing. So he was laughing at that point. And he said, so I find it really funny because to the next question is the perfect map of what my mind was going through. And as scientists, we'd say, well, what exactly was your mind going through? Because this is a 1-minute segment where you're lining up your subjective experience. And this is where we can turn to Evan and others. And in a study that Kathy and one of her wonderful undergraduates at Brown helped us with, really led the charge on, we can start to do neurophenomenological mapping of at least some markers or some neurocorrelates of subjective experience. And so you can see here, we can start to map this, and this is very similar to what other folks were describing earlier. We can find categories where we've got the open ones that go more into the conceptual, and we can see distractive awareness activates the posterior cingulate. When people are trying to control their experience, this also activates it, which was new to us. We hadn't really hypothesized that. Here's an example. I was worried I wasn't using the graph as an object, so I tried to look at it harder. Just for lack of time, I'm gonna skip through this a bit. Same thing with deactivation. A lot of concentration deactivates it. Effortless doing also deactivated it, which was a new category for us. This one, the person said, the more I relaxed and stopped trying to do anything, the bluer it went, which is where now I understand what Yoda was talking about. I'll just finish by saying we can now start to bring this back into the clinical realm a bit, as well as do more neurophenomenologic studies with using source estimated EEG. Here are just some examples where we have people come in, do a little bit of an anxiety test and start meditating. Here's another example of that, where we can start to line up their subjective experience. So back to the present, we have I use this as a placeholder because a lot of people have described McMindfulness, right? And I'm loving it. Well, somebody's loving it when they're going out and teaching corporate mindfulness with the adage, you can get more concentrated, you can be more creative, you can do this or that. And so it's a wild west out there. And so one of the priorities for the Center for Mindfulness in terms of research is to really support what we have three pillars. So we have the stress reduction clinic, which is where everything started. We have this OASIS professional education and training, where we're training MBSR teachers and then the lab to study this stuff. So mindfulness is out there, and I think the Center for Mindfulness helped get it out there in the public. Now it can do a chapter, shift in its, or turn a new leaf or turn a new page into a new chapter, where we can then say, okay, well, it's out there. We don't really need to help that go anymore. But we can now try to really support folks what we think of as going deeper. So can we make sure that the MBSR teachers that are trained are actually trained well, whatever training well means, but are not just given some manual and sent out the door? And the reason that I put together here is actually Rick Hecht and I are hoping to start to study. There's this mindfulness-based intervention teacher assessment criteria, I think, MBI TAC, that Willem Kijken and Becca Crane and other folks in the UK developed over the course of 6 years, where they can actually start to develop categories that they can try to, as much as they can, objectively rate teachers in different domains of teaching, so that we can have some type of a standardized measure. They've developed this. We don't really know if it works clinically because nobody's linked this to outcomes. And again, back to these heuristics, we develop these models, we develop these criteria so we can actually see if they line up with real-world outcomes. And that's one thing that we hope to start studying, and we hope that others will study as well, because it's really important as all of this gets out there and as people start training mindfulness facilitators and mindfulness teachers. It'd be great to have some idea of what folks are doing. It may not be the best analogy, but giving, for me to be able to prescribe medication, it's helpful that I go through an accredited medical school and residency program. And in the same sense, I think it's something that we have to ask ourselves as a field when we're studying MBSR training. If people are going out and teaching MBSR as part of some research study, there's a lot of variability in those teachers, and that can affect the results, just as an example. One last thing that I'll mention is we're also trying to develop a global database where people can bring standardized questionnaires that their subjects can answer, and then those can be put into a database that anybody can analyze. And the final thing I'll mention is we're trying to really make this stuff accessible, so we've created a free online community for folks to come together. We specifically beta tested this with mindful scientists. I think a fair number of you have joined that forum, where people can actually come together and debate and share resources and post their most recent papers that they've published so we can all read them. as a way that we can actually work together to move this field forward. So sorry for going a little over time, but I'll stop there and thank mainly first and foremost our subjects, without whom we couldn't do any of this work, as well as all the other folks that put a lot of effort into this work. So thanks very much.
So we have a few minutes for questions, and we'll take a short break and then come back for the final discussion.
Thank you. That was really interesting, and I felt like I learned a lot. But I'm just going to give you my 2 cents.
Please.
Okay.
Give 3.
It's sort of towards the end of the day, and my sugar level's gotten a little low, so now I'll just be more frank. What about the source localization in the PCC? I mean, do we really believe that?
With EEG?
Yeah, and the whole thing. I mean, because it's very beautiful data that you're showing, and there's something I'm not totally sure that do you know what I mean?
Yeah. So we just completed a study with the experienced and novice meditators with that, where it seems to line up with their subjective experience pretty well, but we don't feel super comfortable with that. So we've been working with some of my collaborators at MIT to get a simultaneous EEG fMRI rig up and running. As I'm sure you and Cliff know, that is a monumental task. So we hope to be able to test that shortly, but it's there. People argue that source estimation is great, and it's been great for 10 years, and people argue that it's crap, and I don't know.
Yeah, it looks very promising, but I just wonder if an asterisk should be put on it for a while.
Oh, you can put asterisks on every slide that I put up here. Yeah, absolutely. But I, for one, I think it's really helpful to triangulate and bring in different methods to really try to figure out what we have. And so that's, I put that up there as we're starting to do that work. Yeah, thank you for asking the question. Cliff, did you have a follow-up on that one?
Of course.
Great.
Which is, have you moved that around so that you don't find the relationship with subjective experience? Have you created any boundary conditions? Because I could imagine that you have a center of gravity and you have a very diffuse signal, and because it's a diffuse signal, is tapping something related to experience, but it isn't the PCC.
We've looked at...
So do you move it around and see where it goes away?
Right. So we looked at more than 2. We've looked at it versus feedback from the frontal regions, because that's where a lot of the literature's been, and we wanted to see, let's start there, like frontal alpha, for example. And we found that those two don't correlate. So subjective experience correlates with feedback from the posterior cingulate, but not frontal alpha, at least increased alpha.
It'd be interesting just to do an iterative space search.
Oh, that's a great question. Yeah, now my brain is thinking about that. I think that's a great question. Because, one thing that you're getting at that we've certainly seen is confabulation is a real issue in terms of people making up their subjective experience.
Yeah, that was like what Evan mentioned.
Yeah. So my grandmother died of after about 10 years of Alzheimer's disease, and I could watch her confabulate more and more and more. And I think that's just a marker of kind of probably where we're all on some type of a spectrum of subjectively describing what just happened. And so with the study that we did with the EEG neurofeedback with experienced meditators, we blinded them. We can flip, we can do invert signal, we can give different brain regions, we can do all this stuff. We can even blind ourselves, which I think is important to do.
What about just not give them any feedback?
Yeah. Not give them feedback?
Period. Just don't give them feedback. Make it 2 separate tracks.
Oh, yeah. Sorry. So, yes, we did that. Yes, we have done that as well. That wasn't part of the official study. Is that true? In terms of the neurophenomenologic stuff, we didn't, but we have done that, and we did that bunch of pilot work with that before, because that's the most important thing. Yeah. So we would have them press a button or tell us to mark it, and then we would go, say, okay, do this, and then mark, and we could watch them do this without having any feedback. Okay. Yeah, great question. David.
So they say the last shall be first, and the first shall be last. And it seems like you basically did and talked about everything that Evan indicated was the wrong way to go about doing business. So I'm wondering how you're going in the future. You didn't know what Evan was going to say today necessarily, but now you have heard him, and I'm wondering how you're going to change your ways in order to take into account the various points that he was suggesting for how people in the mindfulness business ought to go about doing business in the future.
Yeah, it's funny, because I heard Evan's talk at Zen Brain, and I don't know if he knew that I was going to be there because he slammed our work, and now he slammed Richie's work.
Which I had participated in.
Right, which he was a co-author on. But I think, well, and then we had a discussion because I think the neurophenomenology is very different than the blobology that we've been talking about, which is why, I really frame this in the context of, when I show the slide of like posterior cingulate in a group average going down, that's really different than subjective, somebody mapping out their subjective experience.
But you just agreed that these people were confabulating.
No, I didn't agree on that. I said that we have to be careful about that because it can happen. So that's why we do all the control experiments to make sure that they're not confabulating their experience, which is one of them that Cliff mentioned, which is have them meditate or have them do something and then meditate, mark that without them even seeing their brain activity so they can't confabulate. So where do we go from here?
It's not clear what they're marking.
Okay, well, we can talk. I don't want to get into the weeds there, but I'm happy to talk with you ad nauseum about this. But I think the second question may be more beneficial for the group in terms of saying, well, where do we go from here, right? And so where we go from here is we can start to map out, and I don't know if this is, I'll have to think more about what Cliff was talking about with boundary conditions that may not be exactly the same. But we can start to bring in more sophisticated methods than just bold signal, where we're just looking at one brain region going up and down. And we can bring in more sophisticated methods than just mapping out neural networks. Because sure, there are neural networks that are firing and that are anti-correlated with other neural networks, but I think those are still just the beginning of the story. If you look at what this practice is about, it's about decreasing suffering, and suffering is an embodied experience. And so really, we still need to bring this back to that embodied experience. Subjective experience starts moving us in that direction where we can look at, okay, what exactly in someone's subjective experience and what exactly in many people's subjective experience lines up with brain region, and then with one regional activation that we can then start mapping temporally with other networks and then anti-networks and et cetera. But I think that's just the beginning. And I'll be the first to be happy to admit that I don't have the answers, but this is why we have to all work together on this stuff. Good question. If you have any, let me know.
With more questions.
Just quickly to bring in, it's kind of a Buddhist perspective 101, which may or may not be relevant to any of this, is that we're all confabulating all the time. And that's what I understood as really being the thrust of Evan's thing. It doesn't mean we can't make distinctions between different ways, different confabulations, but I do think that insight means we have to frame, I think this is just where Evan's coming from, an entirely different way of framing what we're getting at when we talk about this stuff.
Okay. Yeah. Yes, absolutely. And I would, if I understand what you're saying, I would argue that we have to start somewhere. So we have to start somewhere. We have to get our foot in the door somewhere. And
but it can't be. It can't be. We have to see what's going on behind the confabulation. That, at least, that's what's so powerful about what, at least some would argue, is so powerful about the Buddhist psychological insight.
Maybe I'm not understanding, because I'm thinking the confabulation is going to feed back and affect the rest of the system, right? The confabulation is not operating in isolation.
Right, but
right.
If you cease confabulating, that's nirvana.
Yeah,
and there's no phenomenology to nirvana.
He's saying it's all confabulation.
It's all
You don't get
confabulation.
anything but confabulation.
Okay.
You don't get an unconfabulated report. That's what he's saying.
I understand that. We're not studying nirvana.
Yeah, but you're
right?
assuming your reports are, you have to be careful about confabulation So there are some reports that aren't confabulations. They're really giving us an honest report about what this person is experiencing subjectively.
Okay.
And Bob's, to translate Bob, Bob is saying that you're not going to get something that's not a confabulation. So that the...
Okay, I think we're talking about two different levels of confabulation.
There's the confabulation that happens when you make it experimentally less confabulating prone. And then there's the confabulation when the experiment is prone to confabulation. That's, I think, what you're saying.
Yes, well said.
So I think what we need to do now is take a very disciplined 10-minute break, and then we'll come back for the final discussion.